The first project that we had implemented was similar but a little bit different. We had used the same Postman tool and we used only one Python function to implement multiple URL endpoints. This project is going to be different in multiple ways. The first one is that we'll not be using single Python function. We'll be using multiple different APIs and multiple different Python functions to implement all the APIs. The second one is that we'll be using the requests library or the requests module that I had just discussed. And we'll use the requests module to implement all the APIs. First of all, let's try to understand what the project is all about or what the use case is all about. Now, in this particular project, I'm going to talk about a news feed aggregator, meaning that as you already know that we have multiple news channels across the world or in a particular country. And typically what we do is that we read news only from a single channel, the channel that we like or the channel that we are loyal to. But we do not want to do that. We want to provide a diverse view to our readers across all the channels that are available. So that's where we are creating an app which is called Newsfeed Aggregator. And what this app would do, it would pull news from different channels for a particular date. So in the app, there would be two options. One is that you show news for a particular date and for a particular channel, or show news for any channels for a particular date, or from all the channels on a particular date. So that's where these APIs are. The first one is read news. What it would do is that it would use or it would send parameters either date or date and news channel. So if read news passes date, then we'll read the news from all the channels for that particular date only. And the second one would be date and the news channel, in which case news for that particular channel would only be sent. Then we are giving provision to reporters also, citizen reporters, let's say, to add some news to or news articles to multiple channels. That is also possible. And let's say there are multiple channels who take enrollments for citizen reporters. And for those channels, we have created this API. So if you see a news and you are a citizen, you can actually add or contribute to the news or to the media world also. So using this button or maybe a portion of the app, you can upload a picture and send the news details. I'll not be uploading any picture here. I'll just be using this API to send news channels, and you can tell whether this news can be a breaking news or not. And it can be used by regular reporters also. Then we have breaking news. So what happens is that if there's a breaking news, we want to read that news really fast, and there would be a lot of users who try to read that news. Now, if you see, the architecture is a little different. I have few other boxes also. We have read news articles, add news articles, upload breaking news, read archive news, etc. So what are these? What am I going to do is that we'll be still using Postman, but Postman would send the request to this read news API. And this read news API would call read news articles. And this time around, I'll be using NoSQL databases in both the cases. I'll be using AWS DynamoDB and an in-memory database called Redis open source, and also use an AWS service called Elasticache. So these are the two databases that I'm going to use. What this API would do, this API would read from DynamoDB. It would read all the articles for a particular date and a particular channel, or for a particular date only, and all of this would be done or would be read from DynamoDB. Now there are options to read from external APIs also, and which would be mostly used because as it is a news aggregator, we want to get news from other channels also. And a lot of channels provide API. So if you have collaboration with multiple channels, those channels will provide APIs for you to get the news from them, and that's what it is. And we'll be using newsapi.org, which is an external API, free to use. And other news can be captured from DynamoDB. Then we have the second API, which is report news, and this report news API would also call another API, which is add news articles. And whenever we add a report, this will write to the DynamoDB from where the read news articles is reading from. This is the same DynamoDB table. And if the news is breaking news, then what would happen is that we'll use a function, not an API, to put the news in memory database so that the reading is faster, much faster actually. Then you have today's news and the color is yellow and we have question marks here. The purpose of this yellow color is that this will be an exercise for you. You will have to implement the API called today's news and archive news. Now the architecture of today's news is something that you have to implement. So either you can use this API to read directly from only today's news from any channels or a provided channel, or you can use any other APIs that are already provided. So this is an exercise for you to implement the today's news API. Then you have breaking news. Breaking news would be another endpoint and it will read directly from the database. And then we have archive news also. There are users who want to read news for a particular date across the channels or for a particular channel. And what you have to do is that you'll have to use this API to call another API which will read from MySQL database. Now where MySQL database would get the data from, you'll have to create a program, Python program, which will read from DynamoDB and then upload it to the MySQL database. And from here, you will use this API, read archive news, which will read the records from MySQL database and send it to the archive news. Now the question is, why do we have these additional APIs? Even though I have implemented or I have used read news articles, add news articles, etc., these APIs would be reading from the database. Why do we need a separate API? The first is, of course, I want to show you how to implement the requests library. That is the first purpose of this. But the more important and major reason is that the front-end APIs never communicate to the database directly. So that's why what we are doing is that we are using a separate API which will read from the database and then it will send it back to the front-end API. In this course, I have not shown you how to implement authentication, but there would be very stringent authentication in place, and that authentication layer or the governance layer would only allow on a few APIs to be read from the database and write to the database. In this case, for in-memory, we are using the breaking news directly because we want the news to be read by the users as fast as they can. So this is how the architecture is. We have these front-end APIs, read news, report news, today's news, breaking news and archive news. Today's news and archive news are something that you have to implement. The architecture of today's news is not mentioned. That is something you'll have to build and then implement. Archive news is something that will use another API that will read from MySQL database, and the data in MySQL database would be loaded by a function called archive article, which will read from DynamoDB and load it to MySQL. This is a Python program that you have to write. The other APIs like read news, it would read from the API called read news articles. It will read from DynamoDB table for a particular API, and it can also read from external API, which is provided by the news channels. Then there is one more API called add news articles, which will be called by the front-end API report news. The citizen reporters or actual reporters would use this API or maybe a button in the app to add a particular news in the DynamoDB table. And if it is a breaking news, a function would be used to load the records in the in-memory database also, which is Redis. And then the breaking news front-end API will read directly from the in-memory database, provided the date and the news channel is passed along with it. I hope the requirement is clear. If not, please, you can go ahead and ask questions in the comments, or you can send questions in the Q&A sections also. Okay, so now as you can see that we have different databases, like we'll be using DynamoDB, we'll be using Redis, that will be on AWS Elasticache, and we'll have to create something called an Elasticache cluster that will host the Redis open source system. And all of this would be implemented using EC2 instances. So what will I do is that I'll use two EC2 instances. One would have read news articles, and the other one would have add news articles and upload breaking news. These would be there in one EC2 instance, and read news articles would be there in another EC2 instance. And then I'll use my local machine to host these front-end APIs and use Postman tool to send HTTP requests to these APIs, which will call the APIs which are there in the EC2 instance. Okay, so As you might have guessed that there are certain prerequisites. The first one is you'll have to create an IAM admin user. Why it would be needed? Because to read from DynamoDB, to read from Elasticache, Redis database, etc., we'll need an admin user. Otherwise, the program will not be able to access the DynamoDB table or the Elasticache cluster. And the reason I'll be using admin user, because I do not want to complicate things using IAM user roles. So that's why I'll be creating IAM admin users, and we'll give all the access to that admin user. And then we'll launch EC2 instance, and then we'll have to check the Python version and the AWS CLI versions. So after that, we'll download and install AWS CLI, which will not be needed if we use Amazon Linux operating system in the EC2 instances. So if you use Amazon Linux, then both Python and AWS CLI would be pre-installed, so we'll not have to install that. But we'll have to configure AWS command line interface using the IAM user, admin user that we created in step 1. This is very, very important. We'll have to do the configuration of AWS command line interface. The reason is, as I said earlier, that we'll be using DynamoDB and Elasticache cluster, and we'll be using Python SDK to read records from DynamoDB tables and to write records to DynamoDB tables and the Redis database. So without configuring AWS CLI, the Python program will not be able to access the DynamoDB table. Once the AWS CLI or the command line interface configuration is done, you'll have to install Flask Library using pip3 install Flask. This is a command which you already know. We have already done that earlier. Then we'll install something called a Boto3 library using pip3 install Boto3. What is this Boto3 library? This is a Python library for AWS services. Because we'll be using DynamoDB and AWS Elasticache, that's why we'll need Boto3 library to access those AWS services. Without Boto3 library, we will not be able to access any of the AWS services. So Boto3 is AWS's Python SDK. All right. Then we'll install Redis library using pip3 install Redis, and this will be needed to read the Redis database that will be hosted on AWS Elasticache. And after that, we'll create a DynamoDB table, and we'll have to load the DynamoDB table using this program, load DynamoDB table from file.py. I have already created this program. I'll tell you what changes you have to do to load the DynamoDB table. And it might take quite some time for this program to get completed because I'm not using multi-threading or any parallelism as such. After this is done, we'll create a Redis Elasticache instance, and we'll have to set up connectivity between EC2 and Elasticache. This EC2 instance is the one that we created in step number 2. When we launch the EC2 instance, we'll have to make sure that we set up the connectivity. And this is very important. Otherwise, what would happen is that we'll not be able to make connection to the Redis database. And Elasticache does not allow local machine to connect to Elasticache. We'll have to use EC2 instance only. After this, we'll run the program and we'll do the testing. So let's go ahead and complete the prerequisites one by one. The first thing is that we'll have to create an AWS IAM user. So this is the AWS console. What you have to do is that you'll have to type IAM here and click IAM on a new tab. And here I'll click on users. I already have an admin user created, but let me go ahead and create a new user. 3IAM-admin. Click on next. And what you have to do here is that you'll have to click on attach policies directly and type admin here. And you see you have this administrator access. So click on this and then click on next and then click on create user. So the user has been created. We'll have to come back to this user later on once the EC2 instance creation is done. And this is a very simple way of creating admin users. And if you want to know a little bit more about IAM, you can go through my AWS Essentials training, wherein I have discussed IAM or AWS IAM, Identity and Access Management, in a little bit more detail. After this, what we have to do? We'll have to launch EC2 instance and we'll have to check the Python version and the AWS command line interface version. So to launch EC2 instance, what you have to do, go to the search button and type EC2. You already know how to do this because we have seen EC2 earlier. And I have the instances stopped here, but let me go ahead and create two new instances. I'll name it as newsfeed backend, and here you mention the number of instances to be 2. Do not worry about what these things are, just follow along, and that should be okay for now. If you want to know more about EC2, IAM, VPC, etc., you can go through my AWS Essentials course, which is free by the way. And here I'll select Amazon Linux 2 AMI. Do not select Amazon Linux 2023. You'll have to select Amazon Linux 2. Scroll down and the instance type should be t3.micro. Select this and select the key pair that we had created earlier. The name of the key pair is 3IAM Python Flask key pair. If you want, you can create a new key pair also. Keep the VPC as is. This is the default VPC. In the firewall and security group, click on select existing security group and then click on the default one, which is this one. And that's it. Click on launch instances. So now the EC2 instances would be launched. So two new EC2 instances with the same name, newsfeed backend, would be up and running. And I'll change the name to backend 1 and this one to backend 2. Once this is up and running, then once the status check is green, then I'll log into these two EC2 instances and then we'll check the Python version and the AWS CLI version. And after that, we'll configure the AWS CLI also using the admin user that we just created. Both the EC2 instances are up and running. And let me log in to both of them one by one. This is the first one. Let's see whether AWS command line interface is installed or not. You'll have to type this AWS -- version, and as you can see, we have this command line up and running. Let's see the Python version, Python 3 -- version, and Python 3.7.16 is also up and running. Now what you have to do is that you'll have to configure the AWS command line interface. Before doing the configuration, you'll have to go back to IAM. This is the user that we created. Click on this user and here click on security credentials. Scroll down, you'll see access keys. Currently the access keys are 0. Click on create access key and in the use case select on command line interface. Do the confirmation, click on next and click on create access key. So it has created something called access key and secret access key. So you'll have to use both of these two to do the configuration. So you can click on this and what would happen is that this entire access key would be copied and then you'll have to copy the secret access key later on also, which is not shown now. If you click on show, obviously the secret access key would also be shown. To do the configuration, you'll have to type AWS configure, press enter, and it is asking for the access key ID. You can paste the access key ID here. Then you have secret access key and you can copy the secret access key from the screen, from the IAM console, and then paste it here and mention a default region name. In my case, it is AP South 1, which is Mumbai. Your case can be different, and then type JSON. So this is how the configuration is done. That's all we need to do. We have done the configuration of AWS CLI. Let's do the same for the other EC2 instance also. This is the second EC2 instance. Copy the public IP address and then log in here. And AWS and Python both are already installed actually because it is Amazon Linux 2. So you'll get these three installed automatically. So we have AWS CLI and Python installed. Again, configure AWS CLI. This is the access key ID and this is the secret access key. Mention your default region name and the output format, and that's it. Now you'll have to run the Python programs here. Okay, and if you want to do it from your own machine, let's say if you have Windows based machine or Linux based machine or Unix based machine, whatever, you can do the same thing in your local machine also. But for that, you'll have to download the AWS CLI or AWS command line interface. So after you download and install AWS command line interface, you'll have to run the AWS configure command and then use the access key ID and secret access key to do the configuration, and after that you can run the Python program that I'm going to show you from your local machine also. But right now what am I going to do? I'll be running those Python programs from these EC2 instances. So we are done with AWS CLI configuration. Then we'll have to install Flask, Boto3 and Redis. These are the three libraries. I'm just running the command one after the other, and I'll do the same in the other EC2 instance also. I need to install these three libraries because our programs would be using these libraries. So the installation is done. Now the next prerequisite is to create DynamoDB table and load the DynamoDB table using this Python program. So for that, type DynamoDB here and open DynamoDB in a new tab. I have already created the table. The name of the table is 3IAM news articles, but let me show you how to create it. Click on create table and let's say you name it as, give it a name as news article table, and the partition key should be article published at. This is the name of the partition key, and the name of the sort key should be article channel ID, and the data type can be mentioned here. It can be either binary, number or string. Please mention string in both the cases, and keep all the other things, keep the default table settings as is, and then click on create table. So what would happen is that after you do this, this table would be created. I have named the table as 3IAM news articles, and I have loaded approximately 60,000 records in this particular table using the same program. And the program that I was talking about is this one, which is load DynamoDB from file. So what it is doing, it is reading newsfeed articles data.csv, and then it is reading each line and inserting the line in DynamoDB. Just copy this program in the EC2 instance and then run the program. Of course, you'll have to copy this file also, which is newsfeed articles data.csv, which is this one, newsfeed articles data. Okay, before that, a little bit more about what am I doing here. The first thing is that I'm importing Boto3 library, which is nothing but AWS's Python SDK. And using this Boto3 class, I'm using the client method to initialize something called DynamoDB client. And in the client, I mentioned the name of the service, which is DynamoDB, and the region where I want to use this class in, or where I want to use the service in. So I have created the DynamoDB table in Mumbai region. That's why I mentioned the region code as AP South 1. If you create it in some other region, mention the same. Then from here till here, the program is normal. It is reading the lines and then one by one, and then splitting it based on hash. The reason I have put hash instead of comma, because the news articles contain article text also, which contains comma. So that's why I have put hash here. And here, what am I doing? This is the API put underscore item, which is used to insert record in DynamoDB tables one by one. So there are some other APIs also, but I'm using this easiest API available, which is put underscore item. And you have to mention the table name. Here I am using the table name as 3IAM underscore news underscore articles, which is actually the name of the table, and all the columns that I'm inserting. So if you use this program, what you have to do, you'll have to copy this program in your EC2 instance or in your local machine, wherever you want to run the program from. If you're running it in your local machine, make sure you configure AWS CLI, otherwise it will give you error. The program execution will give you error. Then you have to copy the file also wherever you are running the program in. So if you're running the program from EC2, you'll have to copy this file in the EC2 instance, or if you're running it from local machine, you'll have to copy the file there. And the next thing that you have to do is that you'll have to change the table name as per the table name that you have mentioned. And after that, you run the program, just doing a right click and then run the table. I have already run it because it will take fair amount of time. As I say, there is no parallelism. As you can see, I am not using multi-threading. So it is reading approximately 50-60,000 records one by one, and then it is sending to DynamoDB table. So we have created the DynamoDB table, and then we have run the code also, which is load DynamoDB table from file.py. Then we'll have to create Redis Elasticache instance, and then we'll have to set up the connectivity between the Elasticache instance and the EC2 instances that you have created. These are the two EC2 instances that we have created, newsfeed backend 1 and newsfeed backend 2. So we'll have to make sure that the Elasticache instance that you create has connectivity between these two. So let us go ahead and create the Elasticache instance and set up the connectivity. So in the main console, in the search button, type Elasticache and open Elasticache in a new tab. So what we are going to do here is that we'll be creating an in-memory database. The in-memory database engine that I'm going to choose is Redis open source. But we do not want to install that on our own. We do not want to maintain and manage that on our own. So that's why I'm using Amazon Elasticache, which is a managed Redis, Valkey and Memcached service to host our in-memory database. So what you have to do is that click on get started and select Redis OSS here, or else you can go to the left hand side and here we have Redis OSS caches. There are two other caches available, Valkey cache and Memcached cache, but I'll be using Redis open source system. Click on Redis OSS cache, scroll down, you can select design your own cache or you can use serverless. I would recommend that you use serverless because we'll not be using the instance as much. Once our hands-on is done, we'll have to go ahead and delete the instances. So that's why I'll be using a serverless one, so the cost is lesser. I'm naming it as Redis Newsfeed DB. Keep everything as is. Do not change any of the default settings because we'll be using the default settings itself. And then click on create. The creation would take some time. Once the status is available, we'll have to make sure that we can connect to our Elasticache cluster. The status is available now, and what I have to do is that I'll have to make sure that the EC2 instances that I have created, I'm able to connect from the EC2 instance to this Redis Elasticache server or Redis Elasticache database. So there are multiple options here. First, you have connectivity and security, and whatever modifications I'll be making in this particular tab itself. You do not have to do anything in connect to your cache, but here in the connected compute resources, we'll have to click on set up compute connection. Click on this and I'll have to select the EC2 instances. So there are two EC2 instances. This is the first one and this is the second one. So I'll have to select any one of them. So either I can use the backend 1 or the backend 2. Let me go ahead and use backend 2 for the same. So this EC2 instance would be able to connect to this Redis database and click on setup. It will take some time and it has been successfully set up. Then refresh and you should be able to see the EC2 instance that has been added. Now I can set up a few more EC2 instances also. I had used backend 2. Let me add backend 1 also. And so once it is done, you'll be able to see both the EC2 instances coming here. So I'll be able to connect to this Redis Elasticache instance from these two EC2 instances. So all our prerequisites are done. Now let's open PyCharm and take a look at the code and do some coding also.